She walked through a Wyoming blizzard with $11 in her pocket and a brooch at her throat. 3 men opened their door to her. One of them would become her husband. And the man who left her in the snow to die was about to learn what a Boston woman with a Colt in 2 hands looks like. This is her story. The wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains the way a wolf comes down off a ridge, low and patient and certain of its kill. It scraped across the open prairie in long white sheets, lifting snow that had fallen 3 days ago and would fall again before sunrise. It found every gap in every fence post, every crack in every cabin wall, every weak seam in every coat. And it found Eleanor Thornhill. She was on her knees in the drift, and she could no longer feel her hands. The road behind her had vanished. The road in front of her had vanished. The world had been reduced to a howling white nothing, and somewhere beneath the layers of soaked wool and frozen petticoat, her body was beginning to surrender. She knew this the way a drowning swimmer knows it. There was a quietness coming for her that frightened her more than the cold. She tried to stand. Her legs would not answer. She tried again. The drift held her. Somewhere in the screaming dark, she heard a voice she had not heard in 2 years. Her mother. Adelaide Thornhill dead since the spring of '87, calling to her the way she used to call from the kitchen on Beacon Street when supper was ready. The voice was very gentle. It said her name the way only a mother says it, with all the small softnesses pressed into the 2 syllables. Eleanor lifted her head and saw through a tear in the white a single point of yellow light. It was perhaps a quarter-mile distant. It might as well have been 1,000. But the light was steady. It did not flicker the way her vision was flickering. It was real, and it was warm, and it was the only proof in all the visible world that any other living soul existed. She put her right hand into the snow. She put her left hand into the snow. She pulled. She did not stand. She crawled. 100 yards. The light did not seem to move. She crawled. 200 yards. The wind tried to push her sideways into a deep place from which she would not return. She bent her head against it and pushed forward. 300 yards. She could no longer feel her face. She could no longer feel her tongue inside her mouth. She thought of her father dead 2 years now, of a heart that had given out beneath the weight of a ruined shipping company. She thought of her mother dead 6 months after him of pneumonia, or of a heart broken in a quieter way. She thought of Mrs. Henrietta Pemberton, the boarding house woman in Boston, who had pressed a small cameo brooch into her palm at the train station and said, "Child, do not lose this. It is the last thing of your mother in the world." Eleanor still had the brooch. It was pinned at her throat beneath 3 layers of frozen wool. It was the warmest thing on her body because it was the only thing that meant she was still someone. The light grew larger. She saw dimly the shape of a cabin, logs dark against the snow, a porch, a door. She climbed the porch on her hands and knees because her legs had become a foreign country to her. She lifted her right fist. It did not feel like her fist. She struck the door 3 times. Each blow was as soft as a small bird hitting glass. She struck again. She struck a 3rd time. The wind ate the sound. Then the door opened and a man filled the frame. He was very tall. He stood with the firelight at his back so she could not see his face. Only the broad outline of him, the wide shoulders, the long arm extended toward the lamp on the table behind him. He was holding a rifle in his other hand, and he was very still, the way a man is still when he is deciding whether he has heard a ghost. Eleanor opened her mouth to say, "Please." She did not get to the second word. The world tilted. She fell forward. She felt herself caught before she struck the floor by an arm that was warm and hard and steady as a beam. She heard from a great distance a voice say, "Wyatt, get the blankets. Silas, the fire." And then she heard nothing at all. If you are listening tonight from somewhere warm, I want to thank you for being here. If you love stories of the old frontier of mountain men and the women who found their way to them across long miles of bad weather, then this is the channel for you. New stories every week. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already. And down in the comments, tell me where in this country you are listening from tonight. I love to know. There is a man up in Wyoming who told me last week he listens while he splits firewood for his own stove, and that has stayed with me. So go ahead, tell me, then settle in. Because Eleanor Thornhill has a long road ahead of her, and you have not yet met the men whose door she just collapsed against. Now, back to the storm. 6 days earlier, Eleanor Thornhill had stepped down from a passenger car at the Stone Creek Depot and looked at the world for the first time and understood that her life as she had known it was over. The platform was 3 planks wide. The depot was a shed with a stovepipe. The town behind it was a row of false-fronted buildings the color of mud, and beyond the town there was nothing. Only an enormous gray sky pressing down on an enormous brown plain, and farther out the suggestion of mountains so distant they looked like clouds that had decided to stay. She was 23 years old. She had $11 in her purse, a carpet bag at her feet, and a packet of letters in her coat pocket that promised her a house with glass windows, a garden, and a husband. The letters had been signed by a man named Mortimer Blackwood, and over 6 months they had grown warmer and warmer, and Eleanor had read them in her boarding house room in Boston and allowed herself for the first time since her mother died to imagine a future. She did not see the house with glass windows. She did not see a garden. She saw a man in a long black coat standing at the end of the platform, looking at her the way a buyer at the Brighton stockyards looks at a thin calf. He did not come to her. He waited for her to come to him. So she gathered her bag and she crossed the platform with her chin lifted, the way her mother had taught her to walk when she was being looked at, and she stopped before him and said, "Mr. Blackwood." His mouth turned down at one corner. "You wrote that you were a strong young woman," he said. He did not say hello. He did not take her bag. "You wrote that you were used to hard work." "I am," she said. His eyes traveled her like a hand. He did not bother to disguise it. "You are skinny," he said. "Your hands are soft. You would not last a season on my place." The wind moved across the platform and lifted the hem of her travel dress. She did not lower her chin. "I have come a very long way, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "I know how far you have come," he said. "I paid for the ticket." He took an envelope out of his coat. Inside the envelope was a folded sheet of paper, and inside the paper were 2 banknotes, $5 each. He held the envelope out to her between 2 gloved fingers, the way a man hands a beggar a coin from a great height. "This dissolves any understanding between us," he said. "The road back to town runs that way. You can be inside a stove-warm parlor before dark if you do not dawdle." "A storm is coming," she said quietly. "It is not snowing," he said. "It is just gray. You will be fine." He turned his head and spat into the dust beside the platform. "I have somewhere to be." She stood very still. The thing she did next, she would think about for the rest of her life, because it was the thing that proved to her in the moment she most needed to know it, that her father had not raised a girl who broke. She did not weep. She did not beg. She took the envelope from his fingers, and she opened it, and she read the letter inside, which was a brief, cold paragraph, dissolving any obligation he had to her, citing her unsuitability for ranch life. She folded it again. She placed it carefully in her coat pocket beside the brooch. Then she lifted her eyes to his. "Mr. Blackwood, she said you are a coward. You are also a liar, and whatever woman you have decided to take in my place, I hope she has the misfortune to discover what kind of man you are while there is still time. I will find my own way." He blinked at her. He had not expected words. She turned. She picked up her bag. She walked off the platform. She did not walk toward the town. She walked instead toward the farthest line of land she could see. Because on the train from Cheyenne she had spent 2 long afternoons studying a map a kindly conductor had loaned her, and she had memorized the names of the ranches in the valley north of Stone Creek, and she had marked the foothills where the smaller homesteads were said to be. She had $11 and 1 cameo brooch, and she had a head full of names and distances, and she would not walk into a town owned by Mortimer Blackwood and beg. She was a 1/4 mile from the platform when she felt the first flake on her cheek. She was a 1/2 mile out when she understood she had misjudged the sky. She was a mile out when the wind began to move with intent. 2 miles out the world turned white. She stopped. She turned in a slow circle. The town was gone. The road, which had been a faint pair of wagon ruts, was filling fast. She could not see the mountains. She could not see anything but the swirling whiteness and the shape of her own boots disappearing into it. Eleanor Thornhill, 23 years old, daughter of a bankrupt Boston shipping merchant, alone on a plain 1,000 miles from any soul who knew her name, lifted her face into the wind and laughed once, a short, hard laugh, because there was nothing else to do. Then she chose a direction by guess and began to walk. She walked for what she believed was an hour. She walked for what she believed was another. The cold worked on her by degrees. First her fingers, then her wrists, then her cheeks, then her tongue. She fell. She got up. She fell again. She got up again. The brooch at her throat was the only point on her body where she still felt heat, because she had pressed her palm against it twice and given it her last warmth, and now it was holding it. She thought when she fell the 3rd time that she would not get up. She thought of her mother in the kitchen. She thought of her father at the desk where she had found him slumped the morning his heart gave out. She thought, and this was the worst of it, that no one in the world knew where she was, and so when the snow buried her, no one would know to come looking. And then through a brief tear in the white, she saw the yellow light. She crawled. Inside the cabin, before the knock came, 3 men sat in the small circle of firelight that an oil lamp and a stone hearth could make against a Wyoming December. The cabin had been built by their father, Joshua Hollow, in the spring of 1872, with lodgepole pine cut from the slopes of the Bighorns and dragged down by ox team. It had been added to twice. The roof had been replaced once. The fireplace had been laid by Joshua himself, river stone by river stone, and his oldest son could still remember helping carry the smaller ones at the age of 7. The oldest son was 35 years old now. His name was Caleb Hollow. He sat on a bench by the hearth with a hunting knife across his knee and a whetstone moving in slow, even strokes along its edge. He was a tall man, 6.5 feet from heel to crown, broad at the shoulder, and narrow at the hip, with dark chestnut hair cut roughly at the collar, and a 2-day stubble across a jaw that had been shaped by labor and inheritance in equal measure. His eyes were the color of poured whiskey held to a candle. He did not speak much, and when he did speak, he said only what was needed and then stopped. A long, thin scar ran along his lower ribs beneath his shirt. He had received it 5 years ago in a fight over a property line. He did not talk about it. The middle brother sat at the long pine table. His name was Wyatt Hollow, and he was 32 years old, and he was the laughter of the family. He was nearly as tall as Caleb, but slighter, with sun-streaked dark blonde hair he wore tied back with a leather thong, and eyes the color of good whiskey not yet aged. He had been mauled by a black bear at 24 and carried 4 pale claw scars along his right forearm that he showed off at every excuse. He was at this moment cleaning a Winchester model of 1873, his hands moving over the action with the unconscious tenderness a man reserves for a thing he loves. The youngest brother sat closest to the fire on a low stool bent over a scrap of basswood with a small carving knife. His name was Silas Hollow, and he was 28 years old, and he was the quiet one. He had his older brother's chestnut hair gone a shade lighter, hazel amber eyes that took in everything and gave back almost nothing, and the long, careful hands of a man who would, in another life, have been an artist. He could shoe a horse. He could rebuild a wheel hub. He could rivet a stovepipe. He could make a wooden bird so small and so perfect you would expect it to lift off your palm. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, of leather, of the elk stew that had been simmering all day in the iron pot, and faintly of the gun oil Wyatt was wiping along the Winchester's receiver. The wind was working at the eaves. The fire was popping. None of the 3 brothers had spoken in nearly half an hour, and none of them needed to. The knock came so soft they almost missed it. Wyatt's hand froze on the rifle. Silas lifted his head from the bird. Caleb's whetstone stopped on the steel. The 3 of them looked at the door. "Wind," said Wyatt after a moment. The knock came again. 3 taps. A little weaker this time. Caleb stood. He set the knife and the stone on the bench. He crossed the room in 4 long strides, and he picked up the rifle that leaned against the door jamb. He did not raise it. He held it loosely at his side, the way a man holds a tool he hopes not to use. "Who is out there?" he said low. There was no answer. He looked back at his brothers. Silas had set the carving aside and stood. Wyatt had laid the Winchester across the table and risen, his hand resting near the Colt at his hip. Caleb lifted the heavy wooden bar from the brackets. He set it against the wall. He turned the latch. He pulled the door open 6 inches. The cold came in like a struck blow. He saw on his porch a woman. She was on her knees. She was looking up at him. Her hair, what he could see of it under the snow that crusted her bonnet, was the color of dark honey. Her eyes were very blue and very wide and not quite focused. There was ice in her eyebrows. Her lips were parted, and they were the wrong color, a faint blue at the edges. She held in her right hand the strap of a carpet bag, and her fingers around that strap were so white they looked carved. She tried to say a word. She got out the first sound of it. "Pull." Then her eyes rolled back and she went forward. Caleb dropped the rifle. He caught her under the arms before her face struck the threshold. She weighed almost nothing. He could feel through 3 layers of soaked wool that she was burning cold, the way a stone in a creek bed is cold, the kind of cold that has gone past surface and into bone. "Wyatt," he said, "get the blankets. Silas, the fire." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Wyatt was already moving toward the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the corner. Silas was already on one knee at the hearth building, the fire up with the dry pine kindling he kept in a copper bucket. Caleb kicked the door shut behind him with his heel, and the wind died from a roar to a moan against the timbers. He carried her to the rag rug in front of the hearth and lowered her onto it. He brushed the snow from her bonnet and untied the ribbon under her chin and set it aside. Her honey hair, what was not pinned up, came loose against the rug in a long, damp wave. He took her right hand in his. The fingers did not bend. He looked up at his brothers. She walked through it, he said. Wyatt was already there with 2 heavy wool blankets and the bear hide they used in the worst weather. He laid them beside her. Silas had the fire roaring inside 3 minutes. He was already at the stove pouring water from the kettle into a tin basin. Her dress is froze, Wyatt said. I know, said Caleb. The 3 brothers looked at one another. We turn around, Wyatt said. All 3 of us, eyes on the wall. Silas, get the spare flannel out of my chest, the gray one that is the smallest I own. Boss, you cut the laces on her boots. Then we turn. It was the sort of small, practical decision Wyatt was good at. Caleb nodded once. He slipped his belt knife from its sheath and very careful, as if she were already a friend, instead of a stranger, he cut the laces on her boots and eased them off. The stockings beneath were wet through. He did not touch them. He laid the bear hide over her up to the chin so that her hands were beneath it and only her face was in the firelight. Ma'am, he said, you are safe. We are going to step away. There is a flannel beside you. When you are able, you put it on. Call out when you are decent. He did not know if she could hear him. The 3 brothers turned and faced the far wall. Wyatt put his hands in his pockets. Silas folded his behind his back. Caleb stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he listened to the fire and to the wind, and to a faint, ragged breath that meant the woman behind him was still in this world. There was a long minute of silence. Then a voice, very small, said, I am. They turned. She was sitting up. She had pulled the gray flannel shirt on over what must have been a chemise, and she had wrapped the bear hide around her shoulders, and her honey hair was loose around her face. The blue of her lips had just begun to ease back toward pink. Her eyes were focused now, and they moved from one brother to the next, and they did not look afraid exactly. They looked like the eyes of a woman who had decided to be alive a little while longer. Thank you, she said. Wyatt was the first to laugh. It came out short and surprised. Lady, he said, you do not need to thank us yet. We have not fed you. Caleb crossed the room. He took the iron pot off its hook and ladled stew into a tin bowl. He brought it to her with a wooden spoon and set it on the hearth beside her. Slow, he said. Small bites. Your stomach will hurt if you go fast. She picked up the spoon. Her hand shook so hard she could not raise it. Caleb knelt beside her without a word and took the spoon from her fingers, and he fed her himself one slow mouthful at a time, the way a man feeds a sick child. He did not look at her face while he did it. She did not look at his. After 3 mouthfuls, she could hold the spoon herself. After 6, she could speak. My name is Eleanor Thornhill, she said. I came up from Stone Creek this afternoon. I was answering an advertisement. The room got very quiet. She looked up. She saw that the laughter had gone out of Wyatt's eyes. She saw that Silas, who had not spoken once, had gone very still on his stool by the fire. She saw that the man kneeling beside her, the one who had carried her in, had set the spoon down very carefully on the rim of the bowl. You answered, said Caleb. Whose advertisement? She did not want to say the name. She said it anyway. because she had decided on the platform that afternoon that she was done being afraid of this name. Mortimer Blackwood, she said. Wyatt set his coffee tin down on the table so hard the lid jumped. Silas closed his eyes. Caleb did not move at all. But something had come into his face, and Eleanor, watching him, understood that whatever Mortimer Blackwood had taken from her on that train platform was perhaps not the first thing that name had taken in this valley. "He met you at the depot," he said. "He did," she said. She told them. She told them all of it. The ride out, the way he had looked her over, the envelope, the $10, the order to walk back to town, the storm she had seen coming, and he had refused to see, the 2 miles out, the light through the snow. When she finished, she expected one of them to speak. None of them did. The fire popped. The wind pressed the wall. It was Caleb who finally said very low, "He left you on the road." "Yes," she said. "He left you knowing it would snow." It was already starting. Caleb stood. He did not look at her. He walked once across the cabin to the window and back. He stopped before the fire and put his hand flat on the mantel and held it there a long moment, his head bent. Wyatt had not taken his eyes off her. "Ma'am," he said, "you are not going back to town, not tonight, not tomorrow either." "I have nowhere else," she said. "That is not what he is saying," said Silas. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was lower than she had expected, soft, the kind of voice you would lean toward to hear. He was looking at her with his amber hazel eyes, and there was a sorrow in them that had nothing to do with the storm. "He is saying," said Silas, "that you will not be safe in Stone Creek. Mr. Blackwood owns more than half of it, including the bank, including the mayor, and including a judge by the name of Vexley. If he learns that you survived, and he learns where you went, he will come for you. Not for marriage. He will come because you embarrassed him, and he is not a man who suffers embarrassment." She looked from Silas to Wyatt to the broad back of Caleb at the hearth. "You know him," she said. "We know him," said Caleb without turning. "Better than we wish to," said Wyatt. Caleb turned then. He came back to the rag rug and he crouched down so that his amber eyes were level with hers, and when he spoke his voice was as gentle as Eleanor had ever heard a man's voice be. "Miss Thornhill," he said, "you have 2 roads tomorrow. One is I take you down to town, and we put you on the southbound stage to Cheyenne, and we trust the law to keep a lid on Blackwood until you are out of the territory. The other is, you stay here under the roof of this cabin until my brothers and I can find a way to make sure he can never reach for you again. I will not lie to you. The first road is shorter, and the second is harder. You think on it tonight. You answer in the morning." She did not have to think on it. She had decided in a snowdrift 2 miles out from the depot that she was finished running. She had decided on the porch step that the next door she walked through would be the last door she walked through under another name. She had decided, looking up into the fire-lit shape of Caleb Hollow when he opened that door, that whatever this was, she was not going to leave it. "Mr. Hollow," she said. He blinked at the name. "I will give you my answer now," she said. "I am not going back to Stone Creek, and I am not getting on a stage. I will stay, but not as a charity case. I will earn my place under this roof. I can cook, I can mend, I can read, and I can write in English and in passable French, and I can teach if any of you have a mind to learn. I do not want a roof I have not paid for. We will agree on terms, or I will start walking again at dawn." Wyatt grinned. It was the grin of a man who has just seen something he likes very much. Anybody else, he said, hearing what I am hearing? Caleb had not taken his eyes off her face. He looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor thought she saw something behind the amber, something very far down, a thing that had not moved in a long time, begin to move. You will earn your place, he said quietly. You already did. You walked through a Wyoming blizzard on your own 2 feet, and you knocked on my door instead of dying in the drift. We will agree on terms in the morning. Tonight, you eat, and you sleep, and you do not worry about a single thing. You are home now, Ellie. He did not seem to know that he had shortened her name. She did not correct him. He stood. He took his coat from the peg. He pulled it on. Where are you going? Said Wyatt. To the barn, said Caleb, to check on the animals. The wind is changing. He looked back at his brothers. She takes the bed, he said. Wyatt, you and I are in the loft. Silas, the workshop is yours, same as ever. We do not enter that bedroom until she opens that door in the morning. Are we agreed? We are agreed, said Wyatt. We are agreed, said Silas. Eleanor watched the oldest hollow brother step out into the howling dark and pull the door closed behind him. The latch fell. The wind muffled. Wyatt went to the stove and refilled her tin cup with coffee. Silas went back to his stool and picked up the carving and set it on his knee, but he did not cut. He simply looked at the piece of basswood as if it had asked him a question. Eleanor sat in the firelight wrapped in a bear hide in a flannel shirt 3 sizes too large in a cabin that smelled of pine smoke and elk stew and something she could not yet name, and she understood that she had crossed in a single night from one life into another. Outside in the buffeting dark of the barn, Caleb Hollow stood with his forehead pressed against the warm flank of his bay mare, and he breathed for a long time without moving. He stood there with his eyes closed in the smell of horse and hay, and a sentence formed in him without his consent. A hollow keeps his word, he thought. He had not made a word yet. He understood that he was about to. 12 miles south in the warm parlor of the largest ranch house in the Stone Creek Valley, Mortimer Blackwood was at that moment lifting a glass of bourbon to his lips and frowning. He had heard an hour earlier from a hand who had been at the depot that the Boston woman had not gone back toward town. She had walked north, into the open prairie, ahead of the storm. Blackwood was not a man who liked loose ends. He set the bourbon down. He went to the window. He looked out into the white roar. Tomorrow, he thought. Eleanor woke on the morning after her arrival in a bed that smelled of cedar and clean wool. The light coming through the small window above the bed was the strange gray-white light of a world buried in snow, and for a long moment she did not know where she was. She lay very still and listened to the small domestic sounds of a household she did not yet belong to. A kettle being set on a stove, a man clearing his throat, the soft thump of a stick of split pine being added to a hearth, the murmur of 2 voices low so as not to wake her. She lifted her right hand under the blanket and made a fist. The fingers obeyed her. She wiggled her toes. They obeyed her too. She rose. She dressed in the gray flannel shirt and her own travel skirt which someone had hung by the fire to dry. Her own boots stood beside the bedroom door, and someone had stuffed them with newsprint and set them near the wall to dry slowly without cracking the leather. That detail, more than anything else, made her sit down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands for a moment. When she opened the bedroom door, the 3 brothers were at the table. They stood when she came in. All 3 of them. She had not been stood for since her father died. Wyatt, who was at the stove, gestured with a wooden spoon at a chair. "Sit, ma'am. Coffee is hot." Silas was at the workbench by the window doing something to her left boot, and she saw with a jolt that he had repaired the sole that he must have been working on it half the night. Caleb stood at the head of the table. His chestnut hair was damp. He had been to the barn already before sunup. His amber eyes met hers across the room, and he said simply, "Good morning." "Good morning," she said. "Now," said Caleb. He sat across from her. He folded his hands on the table. "Last night you told me you would not stay as charity. You said you would set terms. I told you we would set terms in the morning. It is morning. So I will say what I think is fair, and you will tell me where I am wrong." She nodded. "The bedroom is yours," Caleb said. "Through the winter and as long after as you decide to be here. Wyatt and I sleep in the loft. Silas keeps the workshop. None of us crosses that bedroom door. If you want it locked, there is a hook on the inside of the frame, and Silas will mount the latch this afternoon. You eat at this table with us. You take any portion you want. The food is yours as much as ours." He paused. He was speaking only to her. In return, he said, "If you have a mind to cook, we would be grateful because Wyatt burns most things, and Silas only makes biscuits. If you have a mind to teach, my youngest brother has wanted to read better than he does for 15 years and will not say so. If you have a mind to mend, I will not pretend my coat does not need it. But if you have no mind to any of these things, you may sit by that fire from now until the spring thaw, and we will not say a word. The terms are, you stay, we see to your safety. Anything else is what you choose." Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the table. "Mr. Hollow," she said. Caleb said, "Caleb." "Caleb," she said. "The bedroom I will accept because I am not foolish enough to argue with 3 men about who sleeps where in their own house. The terms I will not accept." His jaw set. Wyatt at the stove turned with an expression of pure delight. "I will not accept," said Eleanor, "an arrangement that asks nothing of me. I am not a guest. I am not a charity. I am a woman who turned up on your porch with a carpetbag and a brooch. And I have a head and 2 hands and a fair memory, and I will use them under your roof, or I will not be under it. So this is my counter. I will cook the meals, all of them 3 a day, because I learned to cook from a French housekeeper in Boston, and I am better at it than any of you, and we may as well admit that early. I will mend whatever you put in front of me. I will inventory your stores this week because I came in by your kitchen last night, and I saw 5 barrels, and I want to know what is in each of them and how long it will last 3 men and 1 Boston refugee. I will read to whichever of you wishes to be read to, and I will teach whichever of you wishes to be taught, and I will not charge for either because reading is the one thing my mother left me, besides this brooch, and a thing you give freely was never yours to charge for." She stopped. She took a breath. In return, she said, "I will accept your roof, your fire, your protection, and the courtesy of your name when you speak to me. We agree on those terms, or I walk out the front door at the end of this coffee and try the next homestead." Wyatt set down the wooden spoon. He came over to the table. He sat. He looked at his older brother. "Caleb," he said, "you are not going to argue with that, are you?" "I am not," said Caleb. "Good," said Wyatt, "because you would lose." A small sound came from the workbench. It was Silas, and he was laughing. It was barely a laugh. It was a breath through the nose and a small movement of the shoulders. But Caleb and Wyatt both turned to look at him as if a hawk had spoken. "He has not done that," said Wyatt to Eleanor, "in about 2 years." Silas looked up. He met Eleanor's eyes across the room. He did not smile exactly. but the amber hazel of his gaze had gone soft at the edges, and he said very quietly, "Welcome to the cabin, ma'am." "Thank you, Mr. Hollow," she said. "Silas," he said. "Silas," she said. That was the morning the terms were set. The days of the deep snow passed in a rhythm she had not expected and did not at first know she was living. The wind would howl all night, and she would wake to the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and she would dress and step into a main room where one of the brothers had already built up the fire, and another had already started water boiling, and the third had already gone out to the barn to break the ice on the troughs. Wyatt was the easy one to know because he wanted to be known. He talked the most. He told stories at supper, leaning back in his chair with his coffee balanced on his stomach, about the bear that had given him the 4 scars on his right forearm, and about a Cheyenne dance hall girl he had once tried to court when he was 19 and had been laughed out of the saloon for trying. He shot a Winchester 1873, the way other men sing. He hummed without knowing he was humming. Silas was harder. He spoke perhaps 30 words in any given day, and most of them were, "Yes, no thank you, more coffee." But Eleanor began to notice within 2 days that he was the one who thought about everyone else first. He was the one who repaired her boot in a single night. He was the one who built her a small wooden footstool for the bedroom on the 3rd afternoon, sanded smooth, because he had noticed that her feet did not quite reach the floor when she sat on the edge of the bed. He was the one who on the 4th night set on the table beside her supper plate a small wooden bird carved out of basswood, no bigger than her thumb, with a tiny notch cut for an eye and a small, precise feathering of tail. She picked it up and turned it in the firelight and felt her throat close. "It is a yellow warbler," he said quietly without meeting her eyes. "How did you know?" she said. "You said last night your mother had a yellow canary in Boston," he said. "I do not have yellow paint, but I thought the shape might be enough." She set the bird down very carefully on the corner of the table near her plate. She did not in front of them cry, but she put her hand over Silas's where it rested on the wood, just for a moment, and squeezed and let go. He did not look up. He did not have to. The tips of his ears had gone red. Caleb was the hardest of all to know. He spoke when he needed to speak. He worked when there was work. He came to meals, ate with her and his brothers, took the dishes to the basin on his way out, and went back to whatever he was doing, which was always something. He repaired tack. He oiled traps. He sharpened tools. He read in the evenings by the fire from a small worn family Bible that had been his mother's. He almost never looked at her directly. When he did look at her, her stomach turned sideways in a way she had no language for. On the 2nd day, he taught her how to read the depth of snow with a sounding pole. They stood together in the dooryard, bundled to the eyes, and he showed her how to sink the pole at intervals, how to feel the moment when it stopped against the buried ground, how to mark the wet line on the wood. The pole was as tall as he was. He held it lightly in one hand and made it look easy. When he handed it to her, she nearly fell over with the weight of it, and she heard behind her in the cabin doorway Wyatt laugh out loud. Caleb did not laugh. He took the pole back and shortened his grip and said, "2 hands, like an axe." And he showed her again, slower, and stood beside her while she did it, and when she got it right, his small approving sound was so quiet she would not have heard it if she had not been listening for it. On the 3rd day, Wyatt taught her to shoot a Colt single-action revolver. They went out to the woodpile behind the cabin during a brief lull in the storm. He set up 3 tin cans on a stump at 15 paces. He showed her how to hold the pistol in 2 hands, how to brace, how to thumb back the hammer, how to breathe out as she pulled. The first time she fired, the kick of the pistol nearly took her shoulder out of joint, and the bullet, by the sound of it, went into the territory of Montana. Wyatt laughed so hard he had to bend over with his hands on his knees. She turned and pointed the empty pistol at him in mock reproach, and he raised both his hands and said, "Ma'am, you are dangerous," and she laughed for the first time since Boston. It was not a polite laugh. It was a real one, the kind that surprises you out of your own throat. When she turned back, Caleb was on the porch watching her. He had come out of the barn quietly. He was leaning against the post with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face was not one she had seen before. It was very still. It was almost grave. That night at supper, when he passed her the bowl of biscuits, his hand brushed the back of hers. Both of them took the bowl too quickly. The bowl rocked on the table. Wyatt said easy and reached for it, and the moment passed, but Eleanor sat afterwards with her coffee cup in both hands and watched the fire and did not look at Caleb again for the rest of the meal. On the fourth day, she did the thing she had said she would do. She inventoried the stores. She made Wyatt carry the lamp. She made Silas write down the numbers because his hand was the neatest. She had Caleb stand at the door of the storeroom with his arms crossed, looking aggrieved while she opened every barrel and crock and tin and called out what was in it. When she finished, she stood with her hands on her hips in the lamplight, and she said, "Gentlemen." "Yes, ma'am," said Wyatt. "You will starve of scurvy by February." There was a silence. "There is not a green thing in this room," she said. "You have no cabbage. You have no potatoes worth the name. You have no onions left. You have apples, but no other fruit besides peaches. 3 months of meat and starch, and not one growing thing." "We are not far enough up the mountain for proper scurvy," said Wyatt. "You are close," she said. Caleb was watching her with that very still expression again. "What do you propose?" he said. "I propose," she said, "that you give me 1 small crock and a corner of the storeroom and a handful of the navy beans and a clean cloth and water that I will change every morning. We will sprout the beans. We will have green shoots in 7 days. I learned it from the French housekeeper in my mother's house. It is what they did in the French Navy. It is what kept their sailors alive on long crossings when the English sailors lost their teeth." Wyatt looked at his older brother. Caleb looked at the floor for a long moment. "Get her the crock," he said. "She had green shoots in 8 days, not 7, because the cabin was colder than a Boston pantry. But she had them. And on the morning of the 9th day, she set a small wooden bowl of them in the center of the breakfast table next to the biscuits, and 3 full-grown mountain men stared at it as if she had set down a piece of the moon. Wyatt picked one up. He chewed it. His face did something complicated. "Tastes like grass," he said, and then immediately, "But I will eat them." Silas reached for a small handful. He ate them slowly. He nodded once. Caleb took 2 between his fingers. He looked at her across the table. He put them in his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. "You are going to keep us alive," he said quietly. It was not a flirtation. It was not gallantry. He said it the way a man says a true thing he has only just realized. That afternoon, Caleb said, "Walk with me." He took her out the back door of the cabin. He led her through ankle-deep snow around the side, past the stack of split pine and the iron tub he used to scald hogs, and up a small slope sheltered by a stand of lodgepole. At the top of the slope was a low bench of land, and on the bench were 3 crosses. The first cross read in carved letters that had weathered 15 years, Joshua Hollow. The second cross read, Sarah Hollow. The third cross was smaller, and the wood of it was paler, and there was no name carved on it at all. Eleanor stopped a few feet back. That one said, Caleb, pointing at the small one, is my sister Hannah. She was 3 years old when she took the fever the winter after our mother died. We did not have the money for the doctor in Stone Creek, and by the time Wyatt rode in to fetch him on his own credit, it was the morning of the third day, and we had already buried her. He did not look at the cross while he said this. He looked out at the white expanse of the valley below. We did not carve her name, he said, because Silas was 20 that year, and Silas was the one who would have done the carving, and Silas could not. He could not even say her name out loud. He still cannot most days, so the cross stays blank. We know who is under it. I am sorry, said Eleanor. He nodded once. My father died in the summer of '75, he said. He was riding fence line up in the high pasture, and a Sioux war party came through, and the Sioux had a grievance with a government that was not him, but he was the one who happened to be there. He took an arrow under the collarbone. He made it home. He did not make it to the second night. My mother, he said, my mother is not what the headstone says. Eleanor did not move. The headstone says she died of exhaustion in '79, said Caleb. That is what we told the man in the assayer's office in Stone Creek when we registered the death. That is what the church record says. That is what is etched on the stone you are looking at. He went very quiet. It is not what happened, he said. He turned his head and looked at her. I am telling you this, he said, because tomorrow or the next day, Mortimer Blackwood is going to ride up to my front door, and he is going to say something to my brothers that they have been afraid to hear for 9 years. And before he says it, I want you to hear it from me first. Not because you are owed it, because I would rather you knew it from my mouth than from his. Tell me, said Eleanor. He told her. He told her about the way Blackwood had bought up the valley parcel by parcel through the '70s at prices set by his own bank, with notes carrying interest no farmer could pay. He told her how after Joshua Hollow died, Blackwood had begun to circle the hollow place, and how Sarah Hollow had refused and refused and refused. He told her how in the spring of '79, Blackwood had ridden up to that very porch with a piece of paper that proposed the sale of the remaining 2/3 of hollow land at a price that would have been an insult to a stranger, and how he had said to Sarah, a widow with 3 sons, that if she did not sign, he would see to it that the territorial court took her boys from her on a charge of unfit guardianship by year's end. He told her how Sarah Hollow had stood on that porch and told Mortimer Blackwood to leave her property and never come back. He told her how 4 nights later, Sarah Hollow had not come down for breakfast. He told her how Caleb, then 26, had gone to her room, how he had found her, how he had found on the table beside the bed the small brown bottle from the apothecary in Stone Creek, the one she had ridden in to buy 3 weeks before, telling her sons it was for sleep. He told her that, under the law, a property owner who died by her own hand could have her holdings tied up by the territorial court for years. He told her how the brothers had that morning agreed among themselves to lie, to say she had taken sick, to say she had gone in her sleep, to bury her quickly before any official came near. Caleb had carried the small brown bottle out to the back of the property and broken it on a stone and pressed the pieces into the dirt with his heel. He was 26 years old that day. Wyatt was 23. Silas was 19. So, when the assayer came, said Caleb, and asked the cause, I said, exhaustion. I was the oldest. I was the one who said it. Wyatt and Silas have lived 9 years thinking that is the truth. They are wrong. And tomorrow or the day after, when Blackwood comes to my door, he is going to say something that is going to make them understand they are wrong. And I would rather you know now what is coming, because I will not have you standing in the middle of the room when my brothers learn that their mother chose what she chose to keep us together." Eleanor stood for a long moment in the snow. Then she did something he had not expected. She did not say anything. She did not weep. She simply stepped past him to the unmarked cross at the end of the row. She knelt in the snow beside it. She put her bare hand flat against the cold, pale wood. She closed her eyes. She stayed that way for perhaps 30 seconds. When she stood up, she said very quietly, "Hannah." That was all. But Caleb Hollow watched her say his sister's name above his sister's grave, and he understood with a small, clean shock that had nothing to do with the cold that this woman had recognized the absence on the cross, that she had known without being told why it was blank, that she had given the name back to the wood the way you give back a borrowed thing. He could not speak for a moment. When he could, he said, "Let us go inside." They walked back together. They did not touch. But the walk back to the cabin was a different walk than the one out, and they both knew it. That night after supper, after Wyatt had gone up to the loft and Silas had gone to the workshop, Eleanor sat by the fire with her mending in her lap and did not for once mend. Caleb sat on the bench at the end of the hearth with the family Bible open on his knee and did not for once read. "I had a girl once," he said. She did not look up. "Her name was Rebecca Mills," he said. "Her father kept the dry goods store in Stone Creek. We had been promised since we were 19 and 17. 2 weeks before the wedding, her father came to her and told her that there was a man with 300 head of cattle and a house in town who had asked for her hand, and that the debts the store had run up at Blackwood's bank would, by a strange coincidence, be forgiven if she said yes to the new arrangement. She said yes," said Caleb. He closed the Bible. "I did not know until much later whose bank had set the terms of those debts. I learned it the way a man learns most things in this valley, slow and after the fact. By the time I understood, she was 3 years married and had a child. So there was no use in going to her with it. There would have been no purpose." He stared at the fire. "I told myself that year that I was done with women. I have not been with one since. I have been very careful all these years not to put any part of myself anywhere a Mortimer Blackwood could reach for it again." Eleanor set the mending down on her lap. "And then," said Caleb, "my brother heard a knock at the door 6 nights ago, and I opened it, and a half-frozen woman from Boston fell into my arms. And I have spent this week telling myself that I am not putting any part of myself anywhere it can be reached for again. And I have spent this week being a liar to my own face." He looked at her. "I am not asking for anything," he said. "I am only telling you because you stood at my sister's cross today and said her name, and a man owes a woman who does that the truth of where he stands." Eleanor lifted her hand. She reached across the small space between the bench and the fire chair, and she laid her palm against his cheek. The stubble of his jaw was rough under her hand. She did not move her thumb. She did not stroke him. She simply held her hand against his face the way you hold your hand against a cold pane of glass to feel the weather on the other side of it. "I am not Rebecca Mills," she said. "I know," he said. She lowered her hand. She picked up the mending. He picked up the Bible. Neither of them looked at the other for a long time. Outside, the wind died at last. The stars came out one by one over the snow fields. In the bedroom late that night, Eleanor Thornhill sat on the edge of the bed in the gray flannel shirt and looked at the latch on the door. She did not turn it. She lay down. She pulled the quilt to her chin. She closed her eyes. What she did not know, what no one in the cabin knew, was that in Stone Creek, 12 miles south, Mortimer Blackwood was at that moment sitting at a corner table in the back of his own bank with a man named Jasper Crane and a man wearing a black judge's coat, and the three of them were drawing a line on a hand-drawn map of the valley with a pencil. The line ran from the depot north across the prairie toward a low slope of foothills, and on the slope of the foothills the pencil stopped at a small square which the man in the black coat had drawn carefully, and which was labeled in a thin, neat hand, "Hollow." The pencil tapped the square once. There said Mortimer Blackwood. That is where she went. The riders came out of the south at first light. Caleb saw them before anyone else did. He was at the top of the porch step pulling on his coat to go water the horses, and he stopped with one arm in the sleeve and looked east along the line of the valley and saw three dark shapes against the new snow moving at a steady walking pace. No hurry, the way a man rides when he wants you to see him coming. He stepped back inside without finishing the coat. "Wyatt," he said. Wyatt was at the table with his hands around a coffee cup. He looked up. He read his brother's face. He set the cup down and stood and crossed the room to the rifle rack on the wall and took down the Winchester 1873 without a word. Silas was at the workbench by the window. He had already seen them. He laid the carving down very carefully in the curl of basswood shavings and reached almost gently for the long Sharp's rifle that leaned in the corner of his workshop, the one their father had carried home from the war. Eleanor came out of the bedroom buttoning the cuffs of her shirt. She looked from one brother to the next and understood at once. "How many?" she said. "3," said Caleb. She crossed the room to the window. She looked out for a long moment. "The man in the middle is Mortimer Blackwood," she said. "The one to his right is the man who was at the depot. I do not know the third." "The third is Obadiah Renfrew," said Caleb. "He is the sheriff of Stone Creek. He is a fair man who works for a county that is owned by the man riding next to him. We will see today which of those two facts wins." He turned to her. "Ellie," he said, "you are going to want to stay inside, behind that door, with the bar across it." "I am not," said Eleanor. Wyatt grinned over the receiver of the Winchester. She walked across the room and lifted her own coat from the peg by the door. She put it on. She took the packet of letters out of the inside pocket of her travel coat, and she transferred the packet into the pocket of the coat she was wearing. She buttoned the coat to the throat over the cameo brooch. "This is not your fight," she said quietly. "It is mine. He came for me. I will be the one standing in the door when he gets here. You three will be where you choose to be, but I will not be hidden." There was a small silence. "A hollow keeps his word," said Caleb. "I know," she said. "So does a Thornhill." He looked at her for a long beat. Then he gave one small nod, and he opened the door. The three brothers and Eleanor walked out into the dooryard together. The sky was a thin, pale blue, the kind of blue you only get over Wyoming after a 5-day storm. The riders were 100 yards out. Caleb stood at center. Wyatt stood 3 paces to his right with the Winchester held loose across his body. Silas stood 3 paces to his left with the Sharps cradled in his arms. Eleanor stood in front of all 3 of them, and she did not draw her shoulders back because they were already back, and she did not lift her chin because it was already lifted. Mortimer Blackwood reined his horse in at 20 paces. "Caleb Hollow," he called, "I have come for what is mine." Eleanor stepped forward one step before Caleb could open his mouth. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. His head turned. He had not expected her voice. "You wrote a letter," she said, "in your own hand 6 days ago, dissolving any obligation between us and enclosing $10 for my return passage. I have that letter in my pocket. Sheriff Renfrew, would you do me the courtesy of stepping down and reading it aloud in front of these witnesses so that we may settle on which of us is telling the truth this morning?" Obadiah Renfrew was a lean man of 50 with a gray mustache and a face that had gone through too many winters to lie about any of them. He looked at Mortimer Blackwood once. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he swung down off his horse and walked the 20 paces across the snow with his hand already out. Eleanor placed the letter in his palm. Renfrew unfolded it. He read it to himself first. His mouth tightened. Then he read it aloud in a clear voice that carried. When the sheriff finished reading, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Eleanor. "Mortimer," he said, "that is your handwriting. It is said Blackwood, but the woman is in breach. She represented herself falsely. She owes me $300 in passage and arrangement." "I will pay you," said Eleanor. He stared at her. "I will pay you $300, she said, "by the autumn of next year. From wages I will earn myself. Sheriff Renfrew will witness the agreement. You will sign a release here this morning that says, when the sum is paid, you have no further claim on me of any kind. We will record it at the assayer's office in Stone Creek before the week is out. That is the offer. That is the only offer. She stands by that," said Caleb behind her, "and so do I." Blackwood's mouth twisted. "Sheriff," he said, "arrest the woman." Renfrew did not move. "I said, arrest her." "On what charge?" said Renfrew. "On the charge of fraud against me." "There is no fraud," said Renfrew slowly, "in a woman riding a train you paid for to a town where you yourself dissolved the arrangement before she was off the platform. You wrote that letter, Mortimer. You signed it. You handed her $10 and walked away. You will not get me to arrest her, not today, not on what I am hearing." Blackwood went very still in the saddle. Then his face changed. He looked past Eleanor. He looked at the 3 brothers behind her. His eyes settled on Caleb. "Boy," he said, "you are a long way from your mother now, are you not?" Caleb did not move. "Tell me something," said Blackwood. "Have you ever asked yourself why your mother's grave sits where it sits, out there on the slope, off by herself, not in the churchyard in Stone Creek with the other women, not in consecrated ground? Have you ever asked why that is Caleb Hollow? Wyatt's hand tightened on the Winchester. "You shut your mouth," Wyatt said. "You shut your mouth right now." "Has your big brother told you," Wyatt said Blackwood, without taking his eyes off Caleb, "what was in the brown bottle on the table beside her bed? Did he tell you when you were 23 what he found in that room? Or did he tell you a softer story?" Silas had gone perfectly still. Caleb did not look at his brothers. He kept his eyes on Mortimer Blackwood, and his voice was very low. "Get off my land," he said. "I am leaving," said Blackwood. He gathered his reins. He smiled. The smile was the worst thing on him. "I just wanted your brothers to know before we ride down the hill what kind of mother they had. So when this woman of yours signs my paper and pays my $300, you remember whose family is the one with the secret. It is not mine." He pulled his horse around. Crane followed. The 2 of them rode back the way they had come, slow, deliberate, not looking back. Sheriff Obadiah Renfrew stood in the snow a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Caleb. "Son," he said quietly, "I am sorry." Caleb did not answer. He could not. Renfrew touched the brim of his hat to Eleanor and walked back to his horse and mounted up and rode after the other two without speaking again. The four of them stood in the dooryard a long time after the riders were out of sight. Then Wyatt turned. He turned slowly like a man under water. He looked at his older brother. His eyes were wet, and his jaw was set, and his whole face was working. "Caleb," he said. Caleb did not lift his head. Caleb, was he telling the truth? Caleb closed his eyes. Inside, Eleanor said, "Inside, all of you. We do not stand out here." She herded them in like a teacher with 3 frightened boys. She closed the door behind her. She set the bar. The cabin was very quiet. The fire had burned low while they were outside. Eleanor crossed to the hearth and added wood with hands that were steady because she had decided they were going to be steady. She turned. She looked at the 3 of them. Caleb was at the table now, sitting heavily on the bench, his hands flat on the wood, his head bowed. Wyatt stood 3 feet from him with his face wrecked. Silas was by the door, his back against it, the sharps still in his arms. He had not put it down. Eleanor went to the rocker by the fire, the rocker that had been Sarah Hollow's. She did not sit in it. She knelt beside it. She put her hand on the worn, smooth wood of the armrest where Sarah had laid her own hand 1,000 evenings, and she looked across the room at the brothers. "I will leave," she said quietly, "if you ask me to. This is your house, and this is your hour, and it is not mine to be in." "Stay," said Silas. It was the first word he had spoken since dawn. "Stay," said Caleb into the table. Wyatt did not speak, but he did not contradict. Eleanor stayed. Caleb lifted his head. He told it then. He told it the way he had told it to Eleanor on the slope above the graves, except that this time the listeners were the 2 boys whose mother it had been. He told them about the brown bottle. He told them about the morning. He told them about the assayer in Stone Creek, and the lie about exhaustion, and the broken glass pressed into the dirt behind the woodshed with the heel of his boot. He told them he had been 26. He told them he had thought he was protecting them. He told them he was sorry. When he finished, none of them spoke for a long time. Wyatt sat down at last on the bench across from his brother. He put his face in his hands. "Why," he said, "not why she did it, why you did not tell us." "I did not know how," said Caleb. That was all he had. Silas crossed the room slowly and laid the sharps down on the table. He sat on the bench beside Caleb. He did not look at his oldest brother. He looked at the fire. "She did it," he said very softly, so we would not be taken from each other. "She did," said Caleb. "If she had signed Blackwood's paper," said Silas, "we would have lost the rest of the land, and he would have come back inside 2 years for the boys." "Yes," said Caleb. Silas nodded once, slowly. He looked down at his hands, the long, careful hands of a man who carved birds. "She did not choose a bottle over us," he said. He had it backwards. "She chose us over the bottle." Wyatt made a sound into his palms that was not quite a sob. Eleanor stood up from the rocker. She crossed the room. She did not say anything. She went to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the corner. She knelt before it. She lifted the lid. She had not in the days she had been in the cabin gone near this chest. It was not hers. But she had thought, listening to Caleb in the snow yesterday, of something her own mother had kept under the false bottom of her sewing box on Beacon Street, where Adelaide Thornhill had hidden the last good banknotes from the creditors in the final weeks of her husband's life. Eleanor had been raised by a woman who hid things from men with bad intentions, and she knew where a woman in a corner would think to put a thing she did not want a stranger to find. She lifted out the folded shawls. She lifted out the small lace collar wrapped in tissue. She lifted out the tin of pressed wildflowers. She set each thing on the floor beside her with great care. Then she ran her fingers around the inside seam of the chest along the joint where the bottom met the sides. She felt the give. She lifted gently. The false bottom came up in her hand, a thin board cut to fit, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper. Beneath it lay a small leather-bound book. She lifted it out. She closed the chest. She walked back to the table and laid the book in the center of the wood between the brothers. "This was your mother's," she said. "I have not opened it. None of you has opened it either, or you would already have known. Whatever is in it is yours to read or not to read. But I think she put it where she put it, because she meant for you to find it when you were old enough to bear it. I think she has been waiting 9 years for you to be ready." The brothers looked at the book. Caleb reached out at last. His hand was not entirely steady. He opened the cover. The handwriting was a woman's, careful and small. Eleanor saw over Caleb's shoulder that the entries were dated. The first one was from the summer of 75, the year their father died. The last one was from the spring of 79. Caleb turned to the last page. He read it to himself first. Then, because his brothers were waiting, he read it aloud. It was 4 sentences. It said that Mortimer Blackwood had come to the porch that morning, that he had said what he had said, that she had thought all night and into this morning, and that there was only one way to stop him from taking her sons. She wrote that she had loved her boys more than any woman has ever loved any boys. She wrote, "Tell them the land is theirs, and they are each other's, and that is what I bought." Caleb's voice broke on the last sentence. He set the book down on the table. Wyatt was openly crying now, without sound, the way men cry when they have not been allowed to cry in 9 years. Silas put his arm around his older brother. For the first time, Eleanor had ever seen him touch another person. Caleb leaned into him. The 3 brothers sat that way for a long time. Eleanor sat in the rocker that had been Sarah Hollow's, and she let them. That night the cabin was very still. Wyatt had ridden down to the spring for fresh water because his face needed weather on it, and the work would help. Silas had gone out to his workshop with the leather book, and he had not opened it again. He had simply carried it out there with him, the way a man carries a thing he wants close. Caleb stood at the back door of the cabin with his coat in his hand. "I am going up to the slope," he said. "I will come," said Eleanor. He did not argue. They walked together up through the snow, around the woodpile, past the iron tub, up the small rise to where the 3 crosses stood in the long blue late afternoon light. Caleb did not stop at his father's cross. He did not stop at the small unmarked one. He stood before the middle cross, where the name Sarah Hollow was carved in letters the wind had begun to smooth. He took off his hat. He stood a long time. "Mama," he said at last into the wind. Eleanor stood 3 paces behind him and did not move. "I told the boys today," he said. "They know now. They are going to be all right. They are not going to be all right for a while, but they are going to be all right after that." He swallowed. "I have to tell you something else," he said. "I am going to lose this land." Eleanor's breath caught. "I am going to lose this land," he said again, "before this is over. Blackwood is not finished. He came up here today to break us, and he did not. And so he is going to come back, and the next time he is going to come for the deeds. I am going to give them to him if I have to. I am. I will give him every acre you bled, for every fence post Daddy raised, every stone of the hearth, if it means he does not put a hand on the woman behind me." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I know what that land cost you," said Caleb. "I know what you bought when you bought it. And I am asking your forgiveness in advance because I do not think the price you paid was for me to keep dirt. I think the price you paid was for me to keep the people in front of me." He stopped. He turned. Eleanor was already crossing the snow to him. He met her halfway. He did not pull her against him. He laid one of his big, calloused hands along the side of her face very gently, and he looked down into her cornflower blue eyes for a long beat in the late blue light above the graves. "I love you, Ellie Thornhill," he said. It was not a question. It was a man telling her a fact about the world. "I love you too." "Caleb Hollow," she said. He bent. She lifted up. The kiss they shared on the slope above the 3 crosses was not long, and it was not greedy, and there was no part of it that asked for anything more than itself. It was the kiss of a man who had decided in the presence of his mother's grave that he was done living small. It was the kiss of a woman who had decided in a snowdrift 2 miles out from a depot that the next door she walked through would be the last one. When they parted, his forehead came to rest against hers. "You are home now, Ellie," he said. "I know," she said. They walked back down to the cabin together. Wyatt was just coming up from the spring with 2 full buckets. He took one look at the 2 of them coming down off the slope hand in hand, and he set the buckets down and he grinned, a real grin, the first one of the day, and he said, "Well, it is about time, Caleb." 2 days later, the second strike came. It came in the form of a knock at the front door at mid-morning when Eleanor was at the stove and Caleb was at the barn, and Wyatt and Silas were in the workshop fitting a new wagon hub. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the door and called, "Who is it?" A voice she did not know answered. "Mail rider, ma'am. Letter for Miss Eleanor Thornhill, care of Hollow Homestead." She opened the door. The rider on the porch was not a mail rider. He was a thin man in a dark coat with a face she had never seen before. But he was alone, and he had an envelope in his hand, and he handed it to her with an oddly fixed smile, and tipped his hat, and was already turning to go before she had thanked him. She closed the door. She set the bar. She opened the envelope at the table. The letter inside was brief. It was signed in a hand she did not know by a Mr. Cyrus Thornhill of Boston, Massachusetts. It claimed to be from her elder brother. It informed her that her father, Edmund Thornhill, was in fact alive in the care of a charity hospital and was failing fast and was asking for her. A passage ticket, the letter said, had been paid for in advance and was waiting at the Stone Creek Bank in her name. She had until the end of the week to claim it, or it would be forfeited. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she laughed. It was a short, hard laugh, the laugh of a woman who recognizes a trick because she has seen one before. She walked to the workshop. She held the letter out to Silas. "I do not have a brother," she said. "My father has been dead 2 years. Tell me who wrote this." Silas took the letter to the window. He held it in the light. He angled it. He turned it over. He pressed his thumb gently against the ink at the edge of the signature. "The ink is fresh," he said. "Not 3 days old. The hand is a forgery, but a good one. Whoever wrote this had a sample of someone's writing to copy." He paused. He looked at her. "This is Blackwood. This is his second move. He cannot drag you out of here by force, so he is trying to draw you out by grief." Wyatt, who had been listening, set down the wagon hub. "Brothers," he said. They went to find Caleb. Caleb read the letter. He set it on the table. He was quiet a long moment. "We go to Stone Creek," he said. "We four. We go tomorrow at dawn. We go to the bank and we go to the assayer and we make this whole thing public. Sheriff Renfrew has already sided with us in the snow once. We give him another chance. We expose the forgery in front of the bank, in front of the judge, if the judge dares show his face, and in front of as many townspeople as we can put in that street." Eleanor nodded slowly. She added one piece. "I know where Renfrew lives," she said. "I will write him a note tonight, and Silas will ride down at dusk and slip it under his door when it is dark enough that no one sees. The note will tell him to send a private telegraph to the Boston police asking after Cyrus Thornhill. There is no Cyrus Thornhill. The telegraph will come back blank by morning. When we walk into the bank tomorrow, the sheriff will already know. We will not be hoping he does the right thing. We will have given him the proof in his hand." The brothers looked at her. Wyatt let out a long, low whistle. "Boss," he said to Caleb, "she is smarter than the three of us combined." "I am aware," said Caleb. That night Silas rode down to Stone Creek under a half-moon and slipped the note Eleanor had written under Sheriff Obadiah Renfrew's front door. He was back at the cabin by midnight. He had ridden the whole way without meeting another soul. The next morning the four of them rode in together. Wyatt rode lead. Caleb rode beside Eleanor, who was on the gentle bay mare. Silas rode Sweep the Sharps across his knee. They came down out of the foothills in a clean, cold sunrise, and they went directly to the Stone Creek bank and tied their horses at the rail in full view of the morning street, and they walked in a body up the steps and through the door. The bank was full. Mortimer Blackwood was at the back near his private office in a black frock coat, talking quietly with a man wearing a black judge's coat, whose eyes Eleanor recognized at once for what they were, the eyes of a man who had been bought a long time ago. There was a third man standing at the counter, neat, slim, with a satchel at his feet, looking nervous. Eleanor knew without being introduced that this third man was the supposed Cyrus Thornhill. He was not Cyrus Thornhill. Sheriff Obadiah Renfrew stood by the door of the bank with his arms folded across his chest, and in his right hand he held a folded telegraph paper, and when the four of them walked in, he gave Eleanor the smallest nod she had ever received in her life. Eleanor crossed the bank floor. She stopped in front of the man at the counter. The townspeople in the bank had gone quiet. "You are not my brother," she said clearly so that everyone in the room could hear her. "My father, Edmund Thornhill, has been dead 2 years. My mother, Adelaide Thornhill, has been dead 1.5 years. I am the only child they ever had. I have my birth certificate here in my pocket, signed by the parish in Boston. Sheriff Renfrew has in his hand a telegraph from the Boston police sent at my request 3 days ago and answered last night, which states that there is no record of a Cyrus Thornhill anywhere in the records of that city. So I am asking you, in front of these witnesses, to state your true name." The man at the counter went the color of paper. He looked at Mortimer Blackwood. Mortimer Blackwood looked at the floor. The man at the counter said very quietly, "Frank Doyle." Sheriff said Eleanor without turning around. "Already on it," said Renfrew, and he was already crossing the floor. He arrested Frank Doyle in front of 40 witnesses. He turned to the judge in the black coat, whose name was Harlan Vexley, and he said, "Your Honor, you and I are going to have a conversation in my office this afternoon. You may decide before then whether to be a help or a problem, but you will not leave this town." He turned to Mortimer Blackwood. "Mortimer," he said, "we are not done, but we will be soon." Mortimer Blackwood lifted his head. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the brothers behind them. "This is not finished," he said. He walked out of his own bank. The four of them came home to the cabin in the late afternoon with the sun setting orange behind them and the sky going the deep, clean blue that only comes after a hard, cold day. So they smelled the smoke before they saw it. Caleb spurred his horse first. They came around the last bend at a hard gallop and saw the cabin still standing, but the barn and the woodshed and the haystack all in flames against the new dark. They saw a single dead milk cow in the snow of the dooryard with 2 bullet holes in her flank. They saw as they pulled up short that someone had used the sap from a fresh-cut pine to write 5 words on the front of the cabin door. "Give her up or lose everything." Wyatt was off his horse before the others. He ran for the burning barn because the barn was where Smoke had been stalled the gray Appaloosa Silas had raised from a foal. Silas was right behind him. They were not in time. Smoke had been shot in his stall before the fire was set. The other horses had been driven out into the yard, and they were standing huddled together 50 yards off, terrified but unhurt. Silas knelt in the snow beside the open barn door in the heat thrown off the burning timbers, and he looked at the body of his horse, and he did not weep. His face went very still and very cold. "I will kill him," said Silas quietly. "Not with a gun," said Caleb beside his brother. "With the law. We have him. We have him already." Silas did not answer. He did not move from the snow. It was Eleanor who said very quietly, "We have to assume he comes here next. He has lost the bank," she said. "He has lost the judge. He has lost the false brother. He has nothing left to play with except the deeds. He is going to come here tonight or tomorrow with whatever men he has left, and he is going to try to take by force what he could not take by trick. We need to be ready." Caleb looked at the burning barn. He looked at his youngest brother in the snow. He looked at Eleanor. "We are ready," he said. Inside, Eleanor was already moving toward the hearth. The deeds to the hollow place were in a tin box on the mantel, and any man with sense would look there first. There was a small loose stone at the back of the firebox that her hand had brushed 3 days ago when she was banking the coals, and under that loose stone there was a hollow no bigger than a fist, where Sarah Hollow had once perhaps kept her own small private things. She knelt at the hearth. She reached. The stone moved under her fingers. She lifted the deeds out of the tin box on the mantel. She slid them into the hollow behind the firebox. She pressed the loose stone back into place. She brushed ash across the seam until it was indistinguishable from the rest of the hearth. Then she opened the tin box again. She slid into it 3 sheets of blank ledger paper she had taken from Silas's workshop, folded to roughly the same thickness as the deeds. She closed the lid. She put the tin box back on the mantel exactly where it had been. She heard Caleb come in behind her. He stopped in the doorway. He had seen what she had done. He did not ask her why. He only said, "Smart girl." That night, they did not sleep. Wyatt and Silas kept watch in turns from the cabin window, the Winchester and the Sharps loaded and laid across their knees. Caleb sat at the table with the family Bible closed under his hand. Eleanor sat beside him, and they did not speak for long stretches, and the not speaking was a different not speaking than it had been before. The attack came in the gray hour before dawn. It came not from the south where they had been watching, but from the east, where Crane and 3 other men had circled around behind the burned barn and had crawled the last 50 yards on their bellies through the snow. They were almost to the cabin door when Silas, who had been about to wake Wyatt for the last watch, saw a single boot print in the moonlight that had not been there an hour before. He did not raise his voice. He simply touched Caleb's shoulder. Caleb was on his feet at once. The next 60 seconds were the longest of Eleanor Thornhill's life. The cabin door was struck open by a shoulder. A man came through it with a pistol raised. Wyatt shot him in the leg from the loft, and the man fell. A second man came through the door behind him, and Caleb met him with the butt of the rifle and put him on the floor. A third man, Crane, came through a side window in a shower of glass and got 2 paces into the cabin before Silas, who had been waiting beside that window with a length of iron pipe from his workshop, brought the pipe down on his arm and broke it cleanly above the wrist. Crane dropped his pistol and went to his knees with a sound that was almost a scream. The fourth man, Mortimer Blackwood himself, came through the open front door, last the way a man comes into a place he believes is already his. He stopped 2 paces inside. He saw Caleb at the table with a rifle leveled on his chest. He saw Wyatt at the top of the loft ladder with the Winchester sighted on the bridge of his nose. He saw Silas standing beside the broken window with a length of bloodied iron pipe in one hand and the long sharps in the other. He saw Eleanor Thornhill in front of the hearth, calm as a lake, a Colt single-action revolver held in 2 hands at the level of his belt buckle. She thumbed back the hammer. The click was very loud in the cabin. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "drop the pistol." He dropped the pistol. "Step away from it." He stepped away from it. "You are going to walk out of this cabin slowly," she said, "with your hands where I can see them. And you are going to walk down the road with my husband and his brothers behind you, and you are going to walk all the way to Stone Creek, where Sheriff Renfrew is going to be waiting to put irons on you for arson, attempted kidnapping, attempted murder, and 20 years of fraud. And then we are going to be done." He stared at her. "My husband," she said deliberately. "Walk." Caleb, who had not yet been her husband by any law, made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Mortimer Blackwood walked. They marched him the 12 miles to Stone Creek through the snow. Wyatt rode point. Silas rode sweep. Caleb walked beside Eleanor, who rode the bay mare. Crane and the other 2 men, the one Wyatt had shot in the leg and the one Caleb had clubbed, rode bound on their own horses. They reached the town at mid-morning. Sheriff Obadiah Renfrew stood on the steps of his small office with his arms folded. Half of Stone Creek stood behind him in the street. Dr. Theodore Whitfield was there with his wife Pearl. Reverend Ezekiel Pike was there with his Bible under his arm. Cornelius Astor, the rancher who held the largest spread south of Blackwoods, stood with his daughter Caroline, a slight, pale young woman of 19 with frightened, brave eyes. Caroline Astor stepped forward when the procession came up the street. "I have something to say," she said, in a voice that shook only at the start before everyone here. "My father and I have been in debt to Mortimer Blackwood for 10 years. The debts are not real. They were created by his bank from notes my father never signed. He has held them over our heads to force me into a marriage I did not want. There are 30 other families in this valley with the same story. I have the books. They are in my satchel. I am giving them to Sheriff Renfrew today, and I am asking in front of all of you that this man be made to answer for what he has done." There was a long beat of silence in the street. Then Cornelius Astor, the father who had not spoken in public on this matter in a decade, said, "My daughter is telling the truth. I am sorry I did not say it sooner." Sheriff Renfrew turned to Mortimer Blackwood. "Mortimer," he said, "you are under arrest." That was the morning the valley turned. By the end of the week, Frank Doyle had given a full statement implicating Blackwood Crane and Judge Harlan Vexley in the forgery, the false letter, the arson, and the attack on the cabin. Vexley fled the territory before the warrant could be served on him and was caught in Cheyenne 3 days later. Blackwood and Crane were transferred to the territorial jail at Laramie. Blackwood would not survive his second winter there. He died of consumption in 1890 alone in a cell. The Hollow brothers were in Stone Creek the morning of the trial of Mortimer Blackwood. They sat in the front row of the courtroom. Eleanor sat between Caleb and Silas, and she held both of their hands during the reading of the verdict, and when the verdict was guilty on every count, she did not cheer. She only closed her eyes for a moment and thought of Sarah Hollow and Hannah Hollow and the long brown bottle and the broken glass in the dirt. Then she opened her eyes and squeezed the hands of the men beside her, and they all stood up and walked out of the courthouse together. Reverend Ezekiel Pike was waiting on the courthouse steps. I do not suppose he said with a small, careful smile that anyone in this party would be interested in a wedding on the way home. Eleanor looked at Caleb. Caleb went down on one knee right there on the snow-packed boards of the Stone Creek courthouse steps in front of the doctor and his wife and the rancher and his daughter and the sheriff and the reverend and half the town, and he asked her properly. He had no ring with him because he had not planned this, but he reached up and took off the wedding band his mother Sarah Hollow had worn for 22 years, the one he had taken out of the cedar chest the night before for safekeeping during the trial, and he held it up between them. "Ellie Thornhill," he said, "I have a cabin and 200 acres and 2 brothers who can be ridiculous and a heart that did not know it was beating until you knocked on my door. Will you have me?" She had him. They were married 20 minutes later in the small white church at the end of the Stone Creek Main Street, with the late winter sun coming through the plain glass windows, and Silas standing as best man, and Wyatt standing as second best man, and Caroline Astor in tears. She did not bother to hide, standing as bridesmaid. Reverend Ezekiel Pike read the vows. Caleb slipped his mother's ring onto Eleanor's finger and held her hand against his chest while he said the words that made her his wife in the eyes of God and the territory of Wyoming. When he kissed her, the small church erupted. That was the spring of 1889. The first thaw came late that year. The snow held the ground until the middle of April. Eleanor turned the small patch of earth behind the cabin into a garden, her first ever, and she planted carrots and turnips and peas and what the Stone Creek seedsmen swore were Wyoming hardy onions. By midsummer, the cabin had a new room added on which Silas built almost single-handedly, and Caleb had bought 20 more head of cattle from Cornelius Astor at a fair price set in the open and recorded at the assayer's office. In August, Wyatt Hollow married Caroline Astor in the same small white church. Cornelius Astor wept openly during the vows. He had not, his daughter would say later, wept at her mother's funeral, and he had not wept when she was born, and he had not wept at any single event of his 64 years on the earth, and he wept at her wedding, because he understood, watching her marry the laughing man, that he had nearly given her to the wrong life, and that something larger than him had pulled her free. In the spring of 1890, Eleanor gave birth to a son. They named him Joshua Edmund Hollow. The Joshua was for Caleb's father. The Edmund was for Eleanor's. Caleb held the small, wrapped baby in his big, calloused hands the morning after the birth in the bedroom that had once been Eleanor's alone, and he wept in front of his wife for the first time in his life. "This is the one," Eleanor said softly. who will carry on what we have built." "We built this with our own hands," said Caleb. In the autumn of 1891, their daughter was born. They named her Adelaide Sarah Hollow for the two grandmothers she would never meet. Wyatt and Caroline gave the Hollows twins that same year, a girl and a boy, and the girl they named Hannah after the small unmarked cross on the slope, and the boy they named Theodore after the doctor. In 1893, Silas Hollow at last, after 2 years of careful letters carried back and forth on the Cheyenne stage, married Lavinia Bramwell, a schoolteacher whom Eleanor had met on a supply trip, and who had small, steady hands and very kind eyes. Silas built a smaller cabin a 1/4 mile up the slope from the main house, and he and Lavinia had 4 children there over the next decade, and the 2 cabins, Eleanor and Caleb's and Silas and Lavinia's, became the 2 anchor points of what was by the late 90s a small, thriving community of homesteads that had once been pieces of the Blackwood Ranch. The 30 parcels of valley land that Mortimer Blackwood had taken from his neighbors over 20 years through forged debt notes and rigged bank terms were in the autumn of 1894 redistributed by territorial decree. Caleb and his brothers did not buy any of them themselves. It was Eleanor, in fact, who proposed to the Territorial Commission that the parcels be sold at fair market price to the families Blackwood had cheated, and she stood in the commission chamber in Cheyenne and made the case herself, and her name was entered on the official record of the proposal, and the commission accepted it. Sarah Hollow's grave on the slope was given a new headstone that summer. The new stone read, "Sarah Hollow, 1834 to 1879. She bought us our lives." Beside it, the small unmarked cross was at last given a name. Silas Hollow carved it himself in a single afternoon in the workshop, and he took it up to the slope at sunset and set it in place with his own hands. It read simply, "Hannah Hollow, aged 3. In 1901, Wyatt Hollow nearly died. A spring flood came down out of the Bighorns faster than any flood any old-timer in the valley could remember. It took out the bridge at the Stone Creek crossing, and it took out 2 outbuildings on the Astor Ranch, and it nearly took the Whitfield child, the youngest grandson of Dr. Theodore, who had been playing too close to the swollen creek when the water rose. Wyatt went in after him. He came out 1/2 mile downstream with the boy alive in his arms and his right leg broken in 3 places. He never walked right again. He used a stout hickory cane which Silas made for him with a brass cap on the bottom and a small carved owl on the top for the rest of his life. He did not, however, lose his laugh. He sat on his porch in the evenings with Caroline beside him and the cane across his knees, and he laughed at almost anything, and his children grew up believing that men who laughed easily lived longer than men who did not. In 1928, 40 years after the night, a half-frozen woman from Boston knocked 3 times on a cabin door in a Wyoming blizzard. Eleanor Hollow stood on the broad porch of the 3-story timber house that had once been a single-room cabin and watched the sun set behind the Bighorn Mountains. She was 63 years old. Her hair was long and white and pinned up in a loose knot at the back of her head, the way she had worn it since she was 60. Her eyes were still cornflower blue. The cameo brooch her mother had given her in Boston was still pinned at her throat, and it had been there nearly every day for 40 years. Caleb Hollow, 75 years old now, sat in the rocker beside her. His chestnut hair was entirely white. His shoulders were not quite as broad as they had been. His amber eyes had not faded. He was watching over the rim of his coffee cup the 11 grandchildren who were chasing one another through the wildflower meadow that ran from the porch to the line of pines at the edge of the property. Joshua Edmund Hollow, 38 years old, was the sheriff of Stone Creek. He had been sworn in by Obadiah Renfrew himself in 1915, the year Renfrew retired, and he wore the badge with the same quiet seriousness his father had worn the responsibility of the cabin. He stood now at the corral teaching his eldest son to mount a horse properly. The boy was 8, and he was determined, and he was getting it. Adelaide. Sarah Hollow, 37, was the school teacher in the small one-room schoolhouse Eleanor had helped to build in 1894. She was in temperament very much her grandmother Adelaide, and in spine very much her grandmother Sarah. She had been married 6 years to a quiet, steady cattleman named Joseph Latimer, and they had 3 children, and the children were on the porch steps with their grandmother that evening, trying to convince her to read them one more story before supper. Up the slope, the smoke rose from Silas Hollow's chimney. Silas was 68 now, gray throughout, and Lavinia was 60, and they came down for Sunday dinner most weeks. Their 4 children had given them 7 grandchildren. The smallest carved birds in the family, the ones the children fought over, were still made by Silas himself in the same workshop with the same small carving knives, and they were still made of basswood. A quarter-mile across the meadow, Wyatt and Caroline's place stood under its line of cottonwoods. Wyatt was 72 and used the cane every day now. Caroline was 68, still slight, still pale, still with the brave, frightened eyes that had made her in 1889 the youngest woman in Stone Creek to stand up in a public street and tell the truth about Mortimer Blackwood. Her daughter, the original Hannah, was now 37, married 3 children of her own. A figure was approaching the porch from the road. He was a thin old man, gray-haired, gaunt, leaning on a stick. He wore a coat that had once been dark and was now the color of road dust. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and took off his hat and stood there with his head bent. Eleanor recognized him at once. She had not seen him in 40 years, but the angle of his shoulders and the way he held the hat were the same. He had been one of the 4 men who came through the cabin door before dawn in the spring of 1889. He was the one Caleb had clubbed with the rifle butt. He had served 35 years for arson, attempted kidnapping, and complicity in 4 lesser crimes. He had walked out of the Laramie Penitentiary 9 months ago. He had been wandering since. "Ma'am," he said. He did not lift his eyes from the porch boards. "Ma'am, I do not have the right to ask, but I have not eaten in a day and a half. I would not bother a soul. I just wondered if there might be a corner of bread or a cold biscuit or a swallow of milk you could spare. I will work for it. I will chop wood. I will not stay. I do not expect you to let me stay." Caleb Hollow set his coffee cup down on the rail of the porch. He looked at his wife. His wife looked back at him. 40 years of marriage had given them a way of speaking to each other without speaking. He saw her decision in the corner of her mouth. She saw his agreement in the set of his eyes. Eleanor Hollow stood up from her rocker. She walked to the top of the porch steps. She looked down at the thin old man. "Sir," she said, "you will come inside. There is elk stew on the stove. There is fresh bread from this morning. There is honey from our own bees. You will sit at our table, and you will eat with us tonight, and you will sleep in the bunkhouse out back. And in the morning my husband and I will see what kind of work might suit a man your age. You will have a roof over your head until you do not want one. That is the offer. That is the only offer." The old man lifted his head. His eyes filled. He could not speak. Winter always ends, Eleanor said quietly, even for men like you. Come inside. He came inside. Late that night, after the grandchildren had been gathered up and taken home by their parents, and after the old man had been fed 3 plates of stew and shown to a clean cot in the bunkhouse, and was asleep before his head touched the pillow, Caleb and Eleanor sat together in the rockers on the long porch. The stars were out over the bighorns. The fire inside the house was banked low. A coyote called once far off and was answered. "Do you remember?" said Caleb the first night. "I think about it every day," said Eleanor. He took her hand. The hand was thinner than it had been at 23, and the knuckles were larger, and there were small brown spots on the back of it. He raised it to his lips and kissed it the way he had been kissing it for 40 years. "I thought you were a ghost," he said. "I almost was," she said. "You knocked 3 times. "I did." "Ellie," he said. 40 years and I still wonder it. What made you knock? You did not know whose door it was. You did not know if it was a kind house or a cruel one. The wind would have killed you in an hour if you had not knocked, but you also did not have to knock. You could have lain down in the snow and slept. Why did you knock? She was quiet a long moment, because she said at last, "My mother used to call me by my name from the kitchen on Beacon Street when supper was ready, and I heard her that night in the storm, and I thought if she is calling me, then I am still someone she is calling for, and if I am still someone I do not get to lie down. I get to keep going. And then I saw your light, and I thought maybe whoever lives in that light will not know my name yet, but will learn it. And I would rather be a person whose name is being learned than a person whose name is being forgotten." He held her hand against his chest. "You are home now, Ellie," he said. "I know," she said. She closed her eyes. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Far off, beyond the meadow and the corral and the cottonwoods and the line of pines, the wind came down once soft and brief off the bighorns. It did not feel like winter coming. It felt like an old story closing the way old stories close in the small, honest sound of 2 old people on a porch in the dark, breathing in time, holding hands, listening to the long, quiet country they had built with their own hands settle around them for the night. 40 years before, in a snowdrift 2 miles from a depot, a young woman had decided not to lie down. This was what came of it. Winter always ends.